Well, here we are at our course, the first lecture of the course on Western scientific medicine. This is Western, it is scientific, it is not Asian medicine, it is not any of the mystical medicines that we've heard about and read about, and it's certainly not alternative medicine. We're sticking to science during this course, and we're doing it using biography as our reference point. Thomas Carlyle, who is one of the early and serious and good historians, is reputed to have said that history is the essence of innumerable biographies. He said this about 1830. Well, if that's really true, and most historians do accept it, then it should be able to be traceable. History should. Any discipline of history should. Any aspect of history should. Any cultural aspect of history should be traceable through the lives of its greatest contributors. And so that is essentially what we're going to do. And during the course of these 12 lectures, we will go from classical antiquity, and I mean 500 BC, as early as that, to modern biomedicine. We are going to go from a period of mysticism and magic to open heart surgery and to organ transplantation. We are going to go from the supernatural and the deity-drenched to skepticism and that beautiful scientific quest that has led us as far as the molecular medicine of this current moment. And geographically, we're going to go from ancient Greece to the greatest of our cutting-edge American medical centers. So this is quite a journey that we're about to take on here. We're going to trace the path of medical discovery from country to country. We're going to trace it from culture to culture. We'll meet a group of men and one woman, as a matter of fact, who are among the most fascinating and I might say the most daring individuals that you will ever encounter in life or in your reading or even in going to the movies. Now, each of them, those that are likable and those that are obnoxious, those that are modest and those that are egocentric, and I'm sure you won't be surprised to know that some scientists have been egocentric, those that are serene and those that are crazed, each of them has a unique story to tell us, but all of them, the thing that unites all of them together, is their extraordinary zeal for discovering, as you'll see, the secrets of nature, what one of the greatest of them, William Harvey, in the 17th century would eventually come to call nature's closet secrets. And there are some tasty side dishes to this stew, this cassoulet, as it were, of genius, because here are some of the things that will come up as we discuss these people. The rise of the universities, their beginning, and how they influenced medical education. The appearance of the scientific method and of what we call inductive reasoning, from the smaller to the higher. The influence of individual personality on achievement. The influence of national character and of the surrounding culture in each country as we go from place to place. The role of the church, interestingly, which may surprise you as to its quality, and always pervading everything, the part that's played in discovery by the psychological makeup of the discoverer, what he or she brings with his strange, often always unique personality to the laboratory, to the clinic, wherever it is. Sir William Osler, who is probably the greatest of the American medical teachers. We call him American, although he was born in Canada and then eventually finished his days in England, but most of his time was spent here at the United States at Johns Hopkins. William Osler once said that we study history, among other reasons, for the silent influence of character upon character. So ultimately, what this course becomes is a series of character studies of the great doctors. So let's begin. And where do we begin? Clearly, we begin at the beginning. And what's the beginning? The beginning is the father of medicine. The beginning is Hippocrates, himself, the great Hippocrates. When we look at all of the writings that have been left to us by this great man, what is called the Hippocratic corpus, the Hippocratic body of writings, we recognize significant differences between the various books. They're different in style. Some of them contradict one another. Some of them just say things that others don't say. Some of them deal with very hard practical stuff like surgery, and some of them deal with very theoretical stuff like ethics, even morality, religion. So we find that it doesn't really sound, except that they're all written in the Ionic dialect, it doesn't really sound as if they were consistently done by one man, and it turns out that they weren't. They were written, as it turns out, over a period of about 200 years by a large group of men. There may have been some women contributors, we're not sure of that, but primarily by a large group of men whose primary interest and whose primary focus was to separate that which is supernatural from that which deals only with nature. It is nature that they were concerned about. Their thought was, as opposed to those who had come before them, that sickness arises out of something in the environment, sometimes something within the person, but never anything that has to be explained through the various deities that they believed in. And therefore, if you're going to treat this illness, it has to be treated using natural methods. It cannot be treated by appealing to the deities. Who are these deities? Who are these deities that they were fighting, that they were opposing, that they essentially overthrew? Who were these deities against whom they wrote what some historians have called the Declaration of Independence of Medicine, the separation from those awful times when no one really understood illness and it was always ascribed to something up there in the clouds? Well, the deities were a large group of gods, but primarily under the control of the great god Apollo, who was also the god of healing. Apollo was, whether married or not, to a nymph named Coronis, and their offspring was said to be this other god whose name was Aesculapius, the great god of healing. And so prior to the days of the Hippocratic physicians in the 4th and 5th century BC, if one was sick, one, of course, said prayers to the great god Aesculapius, but it was more formalized than that. It wasn't just a matter of saying prayers. There were temples devoted to shrines of the god Aesculapius. They tended to be off on breeze-covered hills where the sun could easily reach them. They were near beautiful springs and streams. Cultivated gardens surrounded it. There were statues of the god. They had some idea of what he must look like, with his long curly waves hanging down to his shoulders, and there were statues around him to which one could pray. Robed priests would wander through singing incantations, and there were sacred snakes. They believed in the power of snakes. And the god was said to hold this large staff around which a single snake, the healing serpent, was wound, and that is where, of course, we get the symbol of medicine today, the caduceus. There were animal sacrifices, but the primary focus was on what we might call the therapeutic dream. This isn't a Freudian thing. This is a very different kind of a dream. The idea was to stay in the temple for days and days and days and have a dream. And if you could remember the appropriate dream, you would come to the priest with it, and he would interpret it, and he would tell you what you had to do to get better. Sometimes he would simply say, well, the dream says you will be better in 4 days. Go home and be healed. But sometimes it would be more complicated than that. He would say, well, you've got the wrong job. You really ought to go to Thessalonica and become a numbers runner or something like this. This job of yours, taking care of the sheep in the constabulary in Athens, is not the right place for you. So go do this other thing, or you need a wife, or your wife needs a child, or eat ham instead of pork, whatever it might be. He would give these instructions. Sometimes he would say, you've got to purge yourself. Take some awful emetic until you're having terrible diarrhea and it will go out of you, or drink from a special stream. This is what the gods have said to do. And people would do that. And some people got better. In fact, of course, a lot of people got better, because one thing we do know about medicine is that 90% of us get better regardless of what we do. So they, of course, had a reputation, and because people were religious, following all of these various gods, especially Apollo, whose representative Asclepius was, there was this huge power of suggestion. This was not the way of the Hippocratic physicians. I tend to refer to them, of course, as the Hippocratic physicians, although sometimes I slip into the old pattern of saying Hippocrates. Again, we're dealing with a lot of people over the course of about 200 years, from about 400 to about 200 BC. So, as I say, I will by and large call them the Hippocratic physicians, but once in a while I'll say Hippocrates. What about Hippocrates? There really was a Hippocrates. We don't know anything about him. We know only that his father was named Heraclides. He was a hereditary Aesculapian physician. They did tend to be hereditary. He, Hippocrates, was born in 460 BC on a little island named Kos, C-O-S, which is off the southwest coast of what is now Turkey, where there was a large Aesculapian temple. Just to give you some idea of the exciting time in which this man made his appearance, it was what we call the Golden Age of Greece. It was the age of Pericles, Euripides, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Aristophanes. He was born when Socrates was still alive. His life spanned the entire life of Plato, and he lived for at least a decade during the early years of Aristotle. So this is the best time. This is the time we all read about and study in our classics courses. But that's it. We know only beyond that he was an itinerant physician, as all of these Hippocratic physicians were. Somehow, and we don't know how they came together, probably started on that island of Kos and eventually migrated onto the Greek peninsula and found their way all over this enormity of a Greek empire. What did they leave us? This so-called Hippocratic corpus, this body of knowledge. Where does it come from? What was it? Who wrote it? Well, as I've said, it was written by groups of these men, sometimes individuals, sometimes groups. It is thought that it is the remains of a library that was found on that island of Kos. And it's also thought that a good part of it was eventually transferred to the great library in Alexandria that, as you know, was eventually destroyed. It consists of 70 different texts. They are, in the true sense, variegated. They just cover this entire span of things. Over the years, as historians have studied them, especially during the 19th century when there was a lot of interest in studying Hippocrates, a conclusion was reached that there were certain of them which had particularly high moral or ethical value, or they were particularly useful in understanding the disease process, and somebody or other, some medical historian, although there weren't formal medical historians in the early 19th century, someone who was working on these things, called those works the genuine works of Hippocrates. And today you can go to an antiquarian bookstore and get one of these books that originated in 1850, 1860, called the genuine works of Hippocrates. They are, those genuine ones, distinguished by a particular clarity of thought, by a high moral message, and every one of them by what we can only call a scientific objectivity. They're stepping back, these writers. Again, they're taking away any notion of the supernatural, and they're looking only to use their own personal observations, which they would record again and again and again and teach to their students. And that's what we find in these genuine works, but the rest of the books have this as well. One of the most famous books, and when people own nothing more than one volume of Hippocrates, what they tend to own is a book called The Aphorisms of Hippocrates. Pithy, sententious, clear, in individual statements. It tells you how to take care of sick people and how to live a high moral life. And of all of those hundreds of aphorisms, which were first translated into Latin from the Greek, and then into Hebrew and Arabic, and of course now we have them in English, of all of them, the one that's most famous is the very first aphorism, because it sets the stage for virtually everything that these people did over the several hundred years that they were in existence. And I'll read it to you. Life is short, the art is long, opportunity is fleeting, experience is delusive, judgment is difficult. The art. They called medicine the art of medicine. There are people today who tell you that it's a science. It's never going to be a science. It is indeed an art that uses science, and I think they recognize that. Whenever it's translated, that word art, from the various Hippocratic writings, there's always a capital A on it to distinguish it from other forms of art and artifice. So life is short, the art is long. No doctor can learn what he or she needs to learn in a lifetime. That's the point of that. Opportunity fleeting. A patient comes to us at a particular time in his or her disease. There's a small opportunity to make that diagnosis and cure that patient. If he comes before that time, it's hard to make the diagnosis. If he comes after that time, and we make the diagnosis too late, we can't do anything about it. Experience is delusive. Every doctor likes to say, well, in my experience. Well, the fact of the matter is that any individual doctor's experience is delusive. It can fool him or her. So we use statistics nowadays. That's the big thing in modern medicine, of course, other than molecular biology. But what, after all, are statistics except the combined experiences of thousands and thousands of patients and doctors, with all of the errors that are inherent in that way of looking at experience. Because, of course, every person is always different from every other person, which is why penicillin for strep throat will work 99.8% of the time, but there will always be 0.2% of people for whom it doesn't work, not to mention the therapies for cancer and so on that certainly don't have good records like that. So experience is delusive, judgment difficult. Judgment is the most difficult thing of all. That's what doctors do. That's why they sit at the bedside. It doesn't take someone like me, for example, 8 years to train a surgeon because I'm training him in technical things. It takes 8 years because he or she has to learn judgment, when to operate, when not to operate, how to understand a disease, when to get a consultation, what the outlook is eventually going to be in this disease. So the father of medicine, Hippocrates, or whoever they were, first told us this and first pointed it out. Now, what are some of the principles of Hippocratic medicine, the principles that changed what had come before? Once again, diseases are events that don't happen except within the entire life of an individual. So unlike today, where physicians tend to think of a disease and the patient who brings the disease, they thought of the entire patient. When they treated the entire patient. Nature needs to maintain a condition of equilibrium. That's what they believe. There's an equilibrium within the body. It must be maintained, and part of the way of maintaining it is with what they called innate heat. The heat of the body is generated within the heart. So we have a situation in which there has to be balance, and if anything gets out of balance, the person gets sick. What is the balance of? It is of a group of 4 fluids. This idea of the 4 fluids had actually been inherited from Egyptian and earlier medicine, but they codified it. There's blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Those are the 4 fluids. Every one of us has a particular personality and a particular character based on how much blood we have, how much bile we have, how much phlegm we have, all of this. If we have a lot of blood, we tend to be filled with energy. We are sanguine, the Latin word sang, sanguine personality. A lot of yellow bile, we are bilious, we are quick to anger. Black bile, melancholy in Greek, black bile, melancholic. If you've got too much of that, you're of a melancholic disposition. Phlegm comes from the brain. You make too much of it, you lose some of your brain. You're phlegmatic. So that's where our words come from. They come from the Greek notions of these particular fluids. And of course, some of those fluids are hot and some are cold. And it was the mixture of them that, as I say, made your personality and character, and if they went out of whack, if there was one or another that was too much, you got sick. And the other basic principle, or one of the other basic principles, was that the human body tends to heal itself. So the trick in Hippocratic medicine was an expression that translated from the Greek into the Latin was primum non nocere. First, do no harm. In treating people, first, do no harm. So how did they go about this? How did they go about their treatment? First place, they kept accurate notes and they passed them on to their students. They looked at temperature change, color of the skin, facial expression, skin appearance. They took the history. They looked at abdominal contours. They looked at hair and nails. They smelt and tasted the urine. They tasted the earwax and sweat for any signs that these humors were out of balance. Was it sour? Was it sweet? Was it hotter than it should be? Was it cooler? They took the pulse, not in the sense of timing, but the strength, the quality. Something about that pulse could tell them what they needed to know. Everything had to be observable. You were not allowed to imagine anything. Observation was the key, and as I say, it was all recorded so that other students could be taught. Well, how does nature cure in this system, and how can the doctor help nature cure? They believed that nature tried always to get rid of the excess humor, so that if you had an upper respiratory disease, you could observe the enormous amount of phlegm that was coming out of your nose and mouth, or if you had tuberculosis, not an uncommon disease at that time, or one of the other pneumonia-type diseases, they'd see that phlegm coughing up. Diarrhea could be either yellow bile or black bile, depending on what the diagnosis had been. So the trick was that nature was trying to expel the excessive material, but the doctor had to help. Now, if a patient had a fever, if his skin was hot, if his pulse was fast, clearly you'd have to get rid of what? Blood, of course. So they would open up a vein, and they'd let the blood pour out, trying to get rid of this excessive humor, which was blood. So they used purgatives, emetics, baths, wet poultices, anything that would bring heat to the surface. They would cup people, as a matter of fact. Bloodletting was a major thing, but before they went into any of these treatments, which over the years have come to be called, not surprisingly, heroic treatments, they would try to change diet. They would give people bland drinks, change where they lived, like the Asclepians had done. But then they would go right to it and try to get rid of this humor. Another characteristic of these physicians was their notion of prognosis. Because they kept such accurate records, they were the first doctors to be able to tell you, you're going to live, you're going to die, you're going to get better on the 5th day, and really mean it and really be right. This wasn't like the Asclepians who figured it out in their heads or by prayer. They knew enough about each individual disease. They studied so that when they saw you, they could predict what was going to happen because they had this highly developed knowledge of disease. And what did that do for them? Gave them reputation. Reputation was an important thing for Hippocratic physicians because they were itinerant. and they needed to make a living. Well, when you want to make a living and you're an itinerant doctor, people have to remember when this man was here 2 years ago, he told Dioscorides that this jaundice and this fever would go away in 7 weeks, and my God, it did. When the Asclepian doctor saw him, he said 3 days, and it didn't happen. Reputation was very important for the Hippocratic physicians, and people began to understand that they were different from other doctors. So when you knew a Hippocratic was coming to your area, he was the one you were most likely to go to, which was one of the reasons that so many young men went to the Hippocratic schools and learned Hippocratic methods, because it was really a good way to make a living, in addition to the fact that the morality appealed to a large number of them. They did surgery, they splinted fractures, they took blood and pus out of chests after an injury. There might be a lot of blood and pus in a chest. They developed needles to do that. If they thought blood had accumulated in the skull after an injury, they would make little holes in the skull, just as the Egyptians had done hundreds and thousands of years before, and they became experts in the use of their hands. Some of the Hippocratic literature is filled with telling people little things like how to move your fingers when you're doing one of these operations. There's even a section, how to cut your nails so they shouldn't project too far off the ends of your fingers and hurt people. So they were very practical, in addition to being theoretical, and of course the most theoretical part of their work was their code of ethics, which was the beginning of Western medical ethics. Why a code of ethics? Well, once again, it set this doctor apart from all other doctors. He was not going to take advantage of his position to, let's say, seduce a female member of the household. He was not going to run around telling everybody the secrets of any patient who had come to him. You could depend on him to do that. Their ethics were expressed primarily in the Great Oath. The Great Oath of Hippocrates, which is an interesting thing because it has two parts, the covenant and the ethical code. The covenant is at the very beginning, and if you look at it carefully, you see he is swearing the physician by Apollo, by Asclepius, by Hygeia and Panacea, Asclepius' daughters, to uphold this ethical code, and at the end of it he says, if I don't do this, may something bad happen to me. If I do it, may something good happen to me. But the rest of it is an ethical code. They are the ground rules of a professional society, and they are the ethical principles that permeate the entire Hippocratic corpus. I will not help anyone commit suicide. I will not give any abortive remedy to a woman. I will not cut for stone. In those days, cutting for bladder stones had a hugely high mortality. It was very dangerous. There were many, many complications. So the Hippocratic physicians stayed away from it. But most importantly, in that code were matters of tact with patients, matters of personal morality, matters of confidentiality, and as I say, never ever the possibility or the allowance of a doctor taking advantage of his position. There have been arguments most recently about what does this mean, that the Hippocratic physician would never give deadly medicine. What does that mean to us today in the debates about assisted suicide? Of course, that's a discussion for yet another day, but it's a fascinating discussion. What does it mean when he says, I will give no remedy to produce an abortion in this day of Roe v. Wade? Another argument that today's current medical ethicists argue over. Why did the Hippocratics put this in their oath? But what's important is that for the very first time in the history of medicine, about 300, 350, 200, 100 BC, we have an ethical code that brings doctors together and marks this group of doctors as being different from all others. And this becomes the ethical code that is carried down The young people becoming doctors swore to it. Young people becoming doctors today still swear to it. To me, the whole Hippocratic corpus is exemplified in two statements that are not in the oath, but that are in other parts of it, and I'll read those to you. With purity and holiness, I will pass my life and practice my art is one. And then in the book of precepts, where there is love of humankind, and this to me is the greatest of all, where there is love of humankind, there is also love of the art of medicine.